I quit my family business after years of being used. What happened next will shock you. And Memphis during the 1980s. I learned early on that my family had its own definition of what it meant to pull your weight. My name is Brian, and now at 32, I look back on those years with a mixture of frustration and clarity. It all began with my grandfather, Edward, a man whose passion and grit were the foundation of our family's barbecue restaurant chain. He started it in the 1950s with nothing but a dream and a borrowed smoker, and by the time I was born, it had become a local institution. Grandpa Edward was the kind of man whose handshake meant more than any contract. He poured his soul into every aspect of the business, from crafting the perfect dry rub to greeting customers by name. People didn't just come for the food. They came because they felt like family. That was his magic. But when he passed away in the late 1970s, everything changed. The business was left to my dad, Alan, and my Uncle Henry. They inherited the restaurants, but they didn't inherit Edward's drive or his understanding of what made it all work. To them, the restaurant was a cash cow and a playground, not a legacy to be nurtured. They acted as though success was guaranteed simply because Edward had built a solid foundation. What they didn't realize, or maybe didn't want to admit, was that Edward's presence had been the glue holding it all together. Without him, cracks began to show. Unfortunately for me, they decided early on that those cracks were my responsibility to fix. I was only 10 when they roped me into the family business. It started small. "Brian, why don't you help clean the tables after hours?" my dad would say. Or, "Come along, son, and count the inventory with me." At first, it felt like an adventure. I'd tag along, thinking I was part of something important. But as the years went by, the tasks grew heavier, and the sense of inclusion disappeared. By the time I was 12, weekends were no longer mine. Instead of spending them riding bikes with my friends, I was in the back of the kitchen chopping vegetables and mopping floors. Every time I asked about being paid, Dad would laugh and shake his head. "Family doesn't charge family," he'd say, like it was some sacred rule. What he didn't mention was that this rule only applied to me. My cousin Matt, Uncle Henry's son, never had to do a damn thing. He was always too young or too busy while I worked myself into the ground. The resentment simmered quietly at first, but grew into a steady boil over time. One summer stands out vividly. I was 14, and the restaurant was short-staffed because one of the cooks quit mid-shift. Dad woke me up at 6 in the morning on a Saturday, telling me I had to help out. I spent the entire day sweating over a stove and running food to tables, my legs aching and my shirt clinging to me from the heat. By the end of the day, I could barely keep my eyes open. When I asked if I could take Sunday off to recover, Dad just scoffed. "Recover from what?" "It's called hard work, Brian," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Meanwhile, Matt was at a water park with his friends, eating funnel cakes and riding slides. He even had the audacity to post pictures, grinning like he'd just won the lottery. That was the moment I realized how unfair this setup was. Matt was being groomed for leadership, while I was being worked like a mule. Family gatherings didn't help. They were less about bonding and more about showcasing Matt's supposed potential. Uncle Henry would gush about how Matt was destined to take the business to new heights. "Future CEO material," he'd say, grinning as though he'd already handed Matt the keys to the kingdom. It was a joke. Matt hadn't so much as stepped foot in a kitchen, let alone managed a shift. Meanwhile, by the time I turned 16, I was practically running the weekend shifts on my own. I handled everything: scheduling, inventory, and even smoothing over customer complaints. I remember one time when an order was completely botched. Wrong meat, wrong sides, the whole deal. I fixed it, comped the meal, and handed the customer a gift card as an apology. They ended up leaving a glowing review, praising my professionalism. When I told Dad about it, hoping for some acknowledgement, he just shrugged. "Good job," he said flatly, "but next time, try not to mess up in the first place." It was always like that. No matter how hard I worked, it was never enough. One day, a dishwasher quit in the middle of the lunch rush, and instead of calling another adult or, God forbid, doing it themselves, Dad pulled me out of school to cover the shift. I spent 4 hours scraping burnt barbecue sauce off pans while my classmates were hanging out at the park. The family meetings were the worst. Dad and Uncle Henry would sit us all down in the dining area after hours, and talk about family unity and pulling together for the greater good. What they really meant was that I needed to work harder to cover for their bad decisions. One time, Uncle Henry decided to add a salad bar to one of the locations without telling anyone. No research, no planning, just a truck full of lettuce and croutons showing up out of nowhere. Guess who had to figure out how to make it work? Me. I spent an entire week setting it up, training the staff, and promoting it as best I could. But of course, it flopped. People didn't go to our barbecue joint for salads. When it failed, Uncle Henry blamed me. "You didn't market it well enough," he said, as though it was my job to salvage his half-baked idea. By the time I was 17, I began to realize how toxic this situation was. My friends worked part-time jobs and actually got paid. Their families didn't expect them to sacrifice their entire lives for some misguided notion of tradition. But every time I tried to push back, I was met with the same refrain. "You should be proud to be part of something bigger than yourself." Proud? Of what? Working for free while Matt was treated like royalty? No thanks. At 18, the scales finally tipped. It was a Friday evening, and I just finished an exhausting shift when Matt waltzed in with Uncle Henry. He was dressed in brand new designer clothes, talking about his latest trip to some fancy resort with his friends. Uncle Henry turned to me with a smirk. "You should take notes from Matt," he said. "He's got the right mindset for leadership." I stood there, exhausted and numb. That was the moment I realized I had to get out. But breaking free wasn't going to be easy. My family had spent my entire life tying my self-worth to the business. Walking away felt like betraying everything Grandpa Edward had built. Still, one thing was clear. I couldn't keep sacrificing my happiness for their entitlement. The summer after I turned 18 was a turning point, though it didn't feel like it at first. By then, I had been tethered to the family barbecue business for nearly a decade. My friends were preparing for college or finding jobs that paid real money. Meanwhile, I was stuck working for free in a place that didn't appreciate me. The unfairness of it all was becoming unbearable, but I still felt trapped by obligation and guilt. One Friday night, after finishing an exhausting shift, my cousin Matt strolled into the restaurant with Uncle Henry. Matt, as usual, was dressed to the nines. Designer jacket, polished shoes, and that smug grin he always wore. He talked loudly about his recent trip to Miami, flaunting pictures of luxury hotels and pristine beaches. I was still wearing an apron stained with barbecue sauce, my back aching from hours of work. Uncle Henry turned to me and said, "Brian, you should be taking notes from Matt. He's got the right mindset for leadership." Leadership? Matt had never so much as flipped a burger. He didn't even know how to sweep a floor. I stood there, biting my tongue, but inside, something snapped. Years of frustration, exhaustion, and resentment bubbled to the surface. That was the moment I knew I couldn't do this anymore. But breaking free wasn't going to be easy. My family had spent years convincing me that the business was my destiny, tying my self-worth to a legacy I never asked to carry. Every time I hinted at wanting something else, I was met with guilt-laden phrases like, "You should be proud to carry on what your grandfather built." It was suffocating. One night, I mustered the courage to tell my dad I wanted to go to college. I explained that I wanted to study marketing, a field that had always fascinated me. I'd been drawn to the creative side of business, the storytelling, the strategy, the psychology of branding. For the first time, I allowed myself to dream about a life beyond the restaurant. Dad's reaction was immediate and visceral. His face twisted as though I'd just confessed to a crime. "Why would you waste time and money on college?" he asked, his voice thick with disbelief. "You've already got a career lined up here. You should be grateful for what we've built for you." Grateful for what? I shot back. "I've been working here for years without a paycheck. Matt gets treated like a prince, and I'm supposed to sacrifice my future for this." Dad's jaw tightened, and he leaned forward, his tone growing stern. "That's what family does, Brian. We make sacrifices for each other. Ryan will join us eventually, and you two will run the business together. That's how we keep the legacy alive." There it was again, Matt's name. He was always the golden child, the heir apparent, the one they believed could do no wrong. It didn't matter that he had no experience or interest in the work. In their eyes, Matt was the future, and I was just the workhorse to keep things afloat until he was ready to step in. Uncle Henry chimed in, his tone dripping with condescension. The business doesn't have extra funds for college, he said, as though I'd asked him to sell his car. If you want to go, you'll have to figure it out yourself. We can't be funding personal ambitions. The hypocrisy of that statement hit me like a freight train. Uncle Henry had just bought Matt a brand new laptop for his business classes, fully funded by the restaurant. But when it came to my aspirations, I was on my own. Fine, I thought. If they weren't going to help me, I'd do it myself. If there's one thing the restaurant taught me, it was how to hustle. I applied for every scholarship I could find, took on 2 part-time jobs, and even worked as a delivery driver on weekends. It was exhausting, but I didn't care. Every late night and early morning brought me closer to freedom. The first few months of college were like breathing fresh air after years of suffocating. I wasn't tied to the restaurant anymore, and for the first time in years, I had the chance to figure out what I wanted. My marketing classes were exhilarating, especially the ones that focused on branding and customer behavior. I'd spend hours working on projects, brainstorming ideas, and refining strategies. It felt incredible to use my brain for something other than cleaning grease traps or calculating food costs. Of course, my family didn't make it easy. Dad called constantly, his voice dripping with guilt. "The weekends are tough without you, Brian," he'd say, as though I was supposed to drop everything and drive back to Memphis. One time, Mom called me in tears. "Your dad is so stressed," she sobbed. "Can't you just come home for one weekend and help out?" "No, Mom," I said firmly. "I've got 2 jobs and a full course load. I can't just drop everything." "Well, Matt's been helping out a lot lately," she said, clearly trying to guilt me. I almost laughed. Matt helping out? Sure, maybe he showed up once in a while to supervise a shift, but I knew better. My friends who still worked there told me Matt spent most of his time chatting with customers and avoiding the kitchen entirely. By my second year of college, I had settled into a rhythm. My scholarships covered most of my tuition, and my jobs paid for the rest. It wasn't easy. I pulled all-nighters on marketing projects, only to wake up at dawn for my delivery shifts, but it felt worth it. I was finally building something for myself, something I could be proud of. The guilt trips didn't stop, though. Every time I visited home for the holidays, Dad and Uncle Henry would corner me. "I don't understand why you're wasting time learning about marketing," Dad would say. "We could teach you everything you need to know right here. This business is your future, whether you like it or not," Uncle Henry would chime in. "You're going to come back eventually, so why not start now?" I tuned them out, but it wasn't always easy. They had a way of making me feel like I was abandoning them, even though deep down, I knew they were the ones who had let me down. They never saw me as a person with my own dreams and goals. To them, I was just a means to an end, a cog in the dysfunctional machine they refused to fix. That summer, I decided to take an internship with a local marketing agency instead of working at the restaurant. I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd finally leave me alone. Instead, it only made things worse. "You're working for strangers?" Dad asked when I told him. "How can you be so disloyal to your family?" "It's an internship," I explained, trying to keep my cool. "It's not like I'm moving away forever." "It's the principle of the thing," Uncle Henry said. "You're turning your back on the people who've always been there for you." "Always been there for me?" I thought bitterly. The audacity of their words was almost laughable. But the internship turned out to be one of the best decisions I ever made. Over 3 months, I learned more about branding, digital campaigns, and customer engagement than I ever had at the restaurant. It was exhilarating to finally use my talents in a way that felt meaningful. My family didn't see it that way. When I came home for Thanksgiving, Dad gave me the cold shoulder, Uncle Henry made snide comments about loyalty, and Matt bragged about how he'd helped run the place all summer. I didn't argue. I didn't need to. For the first time, I realized their opinions didn't matter. I was building my own future, and they couldn't take that away from me. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end of the battle. They weren't going to let me go so easily. By the time I was 20, I was finally beginning to understand what freedom felt like. I had spent the better part of my teenage years working for a family business that saw me as nothing more than cheap labor. Escaping to college had been my first step toward reclaiming my life, but the journey wasn't without its challenges. My family, of course, saw my absence as a betrayal. not as the opportunity one needed to grow. Life at college in Atlanta was hard, but it was also exhilarating. I juggled a packed schedule, classes during the day, 2 part-time jobs, and endless nights studying or working on marketing projects. I didn't have time to breathe most days, but I didn't care. For the first time, my efforts were for me, not for a family business that took me for granted. My marketing classes were a revelation. I loved the creativity involved in building a brand, the challenge of understanding customer behavior, and the strategy of crafting campaigns that connected with people. I found myself diving into projects with an enthusiasm I hadn't felt in years. It was incredible to finally see my skills recognized and appreciated in a way they never had been back at the restaurant. My family didn't share my excitement. They couldn't understand why I was so intent on learning marketing when, in their eyes, everything I needed to know was already waiting for me at home. Every holiday or break turned into a battle. Dad and Uncle Henry were relentless, constantly asking why I didn't just come back and take my rightful place at the barbecue business. "You're wasting your time," Dad said one Thanksgiving. He had cornered me in the kitchen while the turkey roasted, his voice dripping with disapproval. "You've got the perfect opportunity to run a successful business, and you're throwing it away to study stuff we could teach you ourselves." I bit back my frustration. "Dad, I'm learning things that could actually help the business," I said. "If anything, you should be encouraging me." He snorted. "Encouraging you to waste money on something you could learn on the job? Doesn't make sense, Brian. This business is your future whether you like it or not." That was their favorite line. "This business is your future." I heard it so often it might as well have been their mantra. Uncle Henry echoed the sentiment at every opportunity, reminding me that Grandpa Edward's legacy depended on me. It didn't matter that I was doing well for myself. What mattered was that I wasn't doing it for them. The more they pushed, the more determined I became to forge my own path. That summer, I took an internship with a small but innovative marketing agency in Atlanta. I knew it would give me the kind of hands-on experience I couldn't get anywhere else, especially not at the restaurant. The agency specialized in helping small businesses rebrand, and I loved every second of it. We worked on campaigns for everything from local cafes to up-and-coming tech startups. I learned how to use social media effectively, how to design eye-catching promotional materials, and how to measure the impact of our efforts. It felt like I was finally doing something that mattered. But back home, my family saw it as an act of betrayal. "You're working for strangers?" Dad asked during one of his guilt-laden phone calls. "After everything we've done for you? How can you be so disloyal?" "It's an internship, Dad," I said, trying to keep my patience. "I'm gaining experience. This will help me in the long run." "Help you with what? Running someone else's business?" His voice was sharp. "You should be using those skills to help us. You owe it to the family." That word, "oh," always rubbed me the wrong way. They spoke as if I hadn't already given them a decade of my life. It didn't matter to them that I was finally finding success on my own terms. To them, I was selfish for wanting something more. When I came home for Christmas, the tension was palpable. Dad barely spoke to me, and Uncle Henry made sure to get his digs in whenever he could. "You know," he said loudly at dinner one night, "it's a shame Brian's not part of the business anymore. We could really use someone with his expertise." I clenched my jaw and focused on my plate. It wasn't worth arguing. By then, I had learned that no matter what I said, they would never see my side of things. To them, loyalty meant sacrificing myself for their benefit, and anything less was unacceptable. Matt, of course, seized the opportunity to play the golden boy. "I've been stepping up a lot lately," he said, grinning as he leaned back in his chair. "Helping out where I can, you know. Gotta keep the family business strong." I almost laughed. Helping out? Matt's idea of helping out was probably supervising a shift or two while scrolling through his phone. He had no idea what it meant to actually put in the work. But Dad and Uncle Henry lapped it up, praising him like he was single-handedly keeping the business afloat. After dinner, Matt cornered me in the hallway. "You know," he said with a smirk, "if you ever decide to come back, I could probably show you a thing or two about leadership." I stared at him, trying to decide if he was being serious. "Leadership?" I said. "You've never even worked a full shift, Matt." He shrugged, completely unbothered. "That's not the point. Leadership isn't about doing the work. It's about knowing how to delegate. I walked away before I said something I'd regret. Matt was a lost cause, and so were my dad and Uncle Henry. They would never see me as more than a tool to be used when it was convenient for them. But I was done letting them define my worth. By my final year of college, I had built a life for myself that I was proud of. My scholarships covered most of my tuition, my part-time jobs paid for the rest, and my internship had opened doors I never thought possible. I was finally free, and I wasn't going to let them pull me back into their dysfunctional orbit. They tried, of course. Dad called me constantly, using every angle he could think of to guilt me into coming home. Mom cried during every phone call, telling me how much they needed me. Even Uncle Henry reached out, though his attempts were less about persuasion and more about thinly veiled manipulation. But I held firm. I wasn't going back. I had spent too many years sacrificing my happiness for their benefit, and I wasn't about to throw it all away now. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was in control, and no amount of guilt or manipulation was going to take that away from me. I was 23 when the call started. At first, they were casual, almost friendly. My dad would ask how I was doing, making small talk about the weather or my work in Nashville. I should have known better. It didn't take long for the real reason to come out. "We're struggling, Brian," he said one evening, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "The business isn't what it used to be. We've had to close 2 locations, and we're barely keeping the others afloat." I stayed silent, gripping the phone tighter. I had seen this coming. Their refusal to adapt, their unwillingness to modernize, and their blind reliance on Matt's so-called leadership had finally caught up to them. I felt a pang of sympathy, but it was quickly drowned out by the years of resentment I'd been carrying. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said neutrally, not offering more. "We could really use your help," Dad continued, practically pleading. "Just for a little while, Brian. You've got the skills we need." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to say yes, to swoop in and save the business that my grandfather had built with his bare hands. But another part of me, the part that remembered years of unpaid labor and constant criticism, wanted to hang up the phone. "Dad, I have a full-time job," I said finally. "I can't just drop everything." "It wouldn't be forever," he pressed. "Just until we get back on our feet." The calls didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, my mom and even Uncle Henry reached out, all with the same desperate pitch. "We need you, Brian. The business is falling apart. Grandpa would be heartbroken if we lost it." They knew exactly how to twist the knife, using my sense of duty and my connection to Grandpa Edward to guilt me. Against my better judgment, I started thinking about it. As much as I resented them, I didn't want the business to fail. Grandpa had poured everything into it, and it felt wrong to let it crumble, even if the current state of affairs wasn't my fault. But if I was going to return, it would have to be on my terms. I spent a week drafting a proposal. If they wanted my help, I needed 40% ownership of the business, full control over operations and marketing, and a competitive salary. I wasn't going to be their doormat again. This time, they would treat me like the professional I was. When I presented my terms, the backlash was immediate. Dad accused me of taking advantage of the family in a time of crisis. Uncle Henry called it extortion. Even my mom, who usually stayed out of business matters, said, "I can't believe you'd put a price on helping your family." "This isn't charity," I said firmly. "You want my expertise? This is what it costs." It took them 2 weeks to come around, but eventually, they signed the agreement. I suspected the mounting bills and angry creditors had a lot to do with their change of heart. Uncle Henry even tried to sneak in a clause limiting my authority, but I caught it and made him remove it. I wasn't going to be undermined before I even started. Walking back into the restaurant felt surreal. Everything was worse than I had imagined. Half the locations were shut down, the open ones were barely breaking even, and staff morale was at rock bottom. The decor hadn't been updated in decades, the menus were falling apart, and their online presence was non-existent. If you Googled the restaurant, the first result was a 1-star review about cold food and rude service. My office was a desk shoved into the corner of a storage room. I had to move boxes of ketchup packets just to sit down. The staff was a revolving door of family friends and underqualified hires. One of the line cooks didn't even know how to make half the menu items. Instead of addressing the problem, Dad shrugged and said, "We can't afford to lose anyone right now." Then there was Matt. By then, he had been given the title of operations manager, a role he clearly didn't understand. His idea of managing was showing up at noon, sitting in the office with his feet on the desk, and scrolling through his phone. If someone needed anything, his response was always the same. Ask my dad or Brian. My first order of business was modernizing the operation. I set up online ordering, partnered with delivery platforms, revamped the menu, and launched a social media campaign. Predictably, Dad and Uncle Henry fought me every step of the way. Social media is just a trend, Dad said dismissively. We've done fine without it. Fine, I snapped. Half the locations are closed, Dad. We're not doing fine. Uncle Henry was no better. When I suggested updating the menu to focus on quality over quantity, he balked. That sounds expensive, he said, crossing his arms. Can't we just stick to what we know? What you know isn't working, I said, barely able to contain my frustration. The turning point came when I fired Matt. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but it was necessary. One morning, he strolled into the office an hour late, holding a smoothie and acting like nothing was wrong. What's up, boss? He said, smirking. You're done, I said, handing him his termination letter. He stared at me in disbelief. You can't fire me, he said. Dad and Uncle Henry will never allow it. They signed off on this, I replied, motioning to the letter. Clear out your desk. To his credit, he didn't make a scene. I think he assumed Dad and Uncle Henry would cave and reinstate him. They didn't. I made sure of that. With Matt out of the picture, I focused on cutting unnecessary expenses, renegotiating supplier contracts, and introducing a loyalty program to reward repeat customers. Slowly but surely, the business started to turn around. Sales increased, staff morale improved, and we even managed to reopen one of the closed locations. But the pushback never stopped. Dad complained constantly about how impersonal online ordering felt. Uncle Henry griped about the fees from delivery platforms. Even my mom tried to guilt me into donating part of my salary back to the business. It would be a nice gesture, she said. You know, to show you're really part of the family. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything I had done, they still wanted more from me. But I wasn't the same person I had been at 18. I had learned to set boundaries, and I wasn't going to let them push me around again. The family meetings were the worst. No matter how much progress we made, Dad and Uncle Henry found ways to nitpick every decision I made. They couldn't stand that I was the reason the business was succeeding, and they refused to give me the credit I deserved. By the end of my first year back, I was exhausted. The constant battles, the lack of appreciation, and the relentless favoritism toward Matt had taken their toll. I had saved the business, but I was starting to wonder if it was worth saving. I lasted 2 years before the final straw broke me. 2 years of pouring my heart and soul into a sinking ship, of battling my dad and Uncle Henry's stubbornness, and of trying to keep the staff motivated while being undermined at every turn. Despite everything, I turned the business around. Sales were up, customers were coming back, and we had a solid online presence for the first time ever. From the outside, it looked like a success story, but inside, it was a nightmare. The breaking point came during a family meeting. By then, I was running operations and marketing single-handedly. I had modernized the menu, negotiated better supplier deals, and launched a loyalty program that had increased repeat business by 20%. None of that mattered to Dad and Uncle Henry. During the meeting, Dad cleared his throat and said, "Brian, we've been talking, and we think it's time for Matt to step up and lead." I stared at him, thinking I must have misheard. "Lead what?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "The business," Uncle Henry said, as though it were obvious. "He's ready to take on the CEO role." My head was spinning. I had spent the past 2 years doing everything, fixing their mistakes, fighting to keep the business alive, and dragging it into the 21st century. Matt had done nothing but collect a paycheck and make excuses. And now, they wanted to hand him the reins? "You've done your part," Dad said, his tone almost patronizing. "Now it's time for Matt to take over." I felt my chest tighten. "You're serious?" I asked, my voice rising. "You're going to hand over everything I've built to someone who hasn't lifted a finger?" Uncle Henry held up his hands like he was trying to calm me down. "It's not about you, Brian. This business was always meant to stay in the family. Matt deserves his chance." I am family, I snapped. Or does that only count when you need someone to clean up your messes? They exchanged glances, and I realized they didn't see me as part of the legacy. To them, I was the hired help, a tool to be used and discarded when it was convenient. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, but it also brought a strange sense of clarity. I was done. The next day, I submitted my resignation and started the process of selling back my ownership stake. Dad tried to talk me out of it, offering to double my salary. Uncle Henry called me immature and accused me of throwing away everything we've built together. Even Mom got involved, pleading with me to reconsider. But my mind was made up. Walking away wasn't easy. For weeks after I left, I kept waiting for the phone calls to start again. The guilt trips, the pleas for help, but they never came. I guess they thought ignoring me would force me to come crawling back. They were wrong. With my newfound freedom, I threw myself into my own career. I moved into a better apartment, started traveling, and took on projects that reignited my passion for marketing. For the first time in years, I felt like I was in control of my life. I didn't owe anyone anything, and the weight that had been crushing me for so long was finally gone. As for the family business, it didn't take long for things to fall apart. Without me there to hold everything together, the cracks quickly reappeared. Dad and Uncle Henry undid most of the changes I had implemented. The loyalty program was scrapped, the menu went back to its bloated, outdated state, and their online presence disappeared entirely. And then, of course, they brought Matt back. I wasn't surprised. From what I heard, they made him the CEO despite his complete lack of qualifications. Predictably, the business began to spiral. Customers complained about long wait times, rude staff, and inconsistent food quality. At least 3 locations closed within the first year of my absence. Do I feel bad about it? Not really. I gave them every tool they needed to succeed, and they chose not to use them. That's on them, not me. I realized the guilt they used to control me was nothing more than manipulation. They didn't want me to succeed. They wanted me to sacrifice myself for their bad decisions. Walking away was the best decision I ever made, and I've stopped feeling guilty about it. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that loyalty isn't about throwing yourself into the fire for people who don't appreciate you. True loyalty goes both ways. It's built on mutual respect and support, not blind obligation. Now, I look back on those years with a sense of pride, not for the business, but for myself. I stood up for what I wanted, set boundaries, and had the courage to walk away. Life is too short to waste on people who don't see your worth. If they can't recognize it, that's their loss, not yours. And me? I'm finally free, and it feels incredible.